Hey, so I recently read this book, Why Socrates Died by Robin Waterfield. Let's talk about it. Socrates. If you're watching this video, I'm assuming you've probably heard of Socrates. It's hard to overstate how influential Socrates' life and death has been on the history of Western philosophy. For instance, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy says that Socrates is one of the few individuals whom one could say has so shaped the cultural and intellectual development of the world that, without him, history would be profoundly different. After being sentenced to death by the citizens of Athens, Socrates became essentially a martyr for philosophy, a great individual killed for standing up for what he believed in. But of course, we only know of Socrates through the lens of aristocratic, conservative writers like Plato and Xenophon, creating what is known as the Socratic Problem. That is, how do we untangle the historical Socrates from the character of Socrates found in the works of Plato? The truth is, of course, more complicated than the simple picture presented to us by Plato. As the back cover of this book says, Socrates' trial and death together form an iconic moment in Western civilization. The picture we have of it, created by his immediate followers and perpetuated in countless works of literature and art ever since, is that a noble man was put to death in a fit of folly by the ancient Athenian democracy. The reality was much more complex. If you watched my video on the trial of Socrates, you know that Socrates was charged with impiety and corrupting the youth. But what if there were deeper reasons which made Athens so threatened by Socrates? Hi, I'm Matthew, and today we're going to begin talking about the elephant in the room of ancient Athenian thought, which is the fact that not just Socrates, but also Plato and Aristotle seem to have had much more criticism than praise for Athenian democracy. Everyone's heard that the roots of our modern Western values, like individualism, liberalism, and democracy, go back to ancient Athens. But if you really dig into the history, you'll see that those values were more often in conflict with each other than in harmony. It may be surprising that Athens' most famous philosophers had little praise for one of its city's greatest achievements, but as we'll see today, the anti-democratic tradition in the West is as old as democracy itself. But before we dive in, as you can see, I'm really trying to increase the quality of these videos. It's going to take me a couple months to get into a groove with my new workflow, but you can expect higher quality videos coming out more frequently in the future. So if you'd like to support the channel, please leave a like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already, and consider donating to my Ko-fi page. And thank you to all my subscribers who have stuck around and supported me as I build this incredibly niche little channel. All your comments really mean a lot, and of course, I read them all. Anyways, let's get into it. There is only one death in the history of the West that is more iconic than the execution of Socrates, and that is, of course, the crucifixion of Jesus. The fact that these two historical events appear to be so similar, two righteous men killed for standing up for their beliefs, obviously was a contributing factor to Socrates' popularity in the Christian West. And like Jesus, but obviously not nearly to the same degree, the figure of Socrates has grown to almost mythical proportions. As Robin Waterfield says, everyone has heard of Socrates, and even if they know little or nothing else about the man, they usually know that he was put to death by his fellow Athenians in 399 BCE. The events surrounding Socrates' death have become iconic, more discussed, portrayed, or merely mentioned than any except those surrounding the death, some 400 years later, of a Jewish prophet called Yehoshua. In fact, the two trials and executions often seem to meld in people's minds, so that Socrates too becomes a kind of martyr, a good man unjustly killed for his views, or for being an outstanding individual in a collectivist society, or something like that. Do a web search for Socrates and Jesus, and you will see what I mean. But Socrates would have been the last to want to leave a cultural icon unexamined, and that is what I do in this book. Examine all the evidence in order to reach a fuller understanding of Socrates' trial and execution than has been achieved before. Socrates' trial was a critical moment in ancient Athenian history, and so provides a very good lens through which to study a complex and perennially fascinating, somewhat alien society. But before we can examine the evidence, we need to address the issue of the Socratic problem. Thankfully, I've already made a video all about that topic. You should go check it out if you want a more in-depth discussion. But here's a quick summary, just in case you didn't watch it. Our main source for Socrates' life and philosophy is the works of Plato, who started out writing dialogues to defend Socrates' practice of philosophy, but more and more over time began to use the dialogue format to explore his own ideas, while retaining Socrates as a mouthpiece. So how do we separate the historical Socrates from the character of Socrates? Here's what I think. First off, Socrates existed. Of course, this isn't a debate among actual scholars, but there are plenty of conspiracy theorists out there who think that the Middle Ages didn't happen, or that people like Socrates and Jesus were completely made up. You might see some of them in the comments section. But just because our evidence for these figures is limited to a few primary sources, doesn't mean that they're completely made up. If Plato made up Socrates or his execution, why did Xenophon write his own account of the trial? Or don't you think, if Plato completely distorted the ideas of Socrates, wouldn't someone like Aristotle call him out on that in his own writings? While Aristotle had his disagreements with Plato's theory of forms, and wrote about them, he never calls Plato a liar or propagandist. I have, however, received comments which do pretty much say this, that Socrates is a noble and heroic figure, and the only reason he espouses anti-democratic and pro-Spartan ideas is because he was co-opted by Plato. As we'll see today, this is not the case. Plato and Socrates were fellow travelers in this regard. One argument I would make is that Plato obviously had a lot of respect for his teacher. Don't you think it would be pretty disrespectful to portray Socrates arguing for ideas that in reality he didn't believe in? And why would Plato admire Socrates so much if he didn't fundamentally agree with his ideas? Robin Waterfield points out that, in fact, no one doubts that Plato had his own agenda, and came to use Socrates as a spokesman for his own ideas. The only question is when this process started and how developed it is in any given dialogue. The most sensible position is that no dialogue, however early, is sheer biography, and no dialogue, however late, is entirely free from the influence of the historical Socrates. Plato, Xenophon, and all the other Socratics were writing a kind of fiction, what, in their various views, Socrates might have said had he been in such and such a situation, talking with this person and that person on such and such a topic. For one thing that is common to all the Socratic writers is that they portray their mentor talking, endlessly talking, either delivering homilies or engaging others in sharp, dialectical conversation and argument. Again, if you want to hear me talk about the Socratic problem in depth, you can check out that video I made. The main point for this video is that, while Plato is obviously a biased source, it's more than likely that Socrates shared his aristocratic, oligarchic bias, and that really the works of Plato represent a development of Socrates' philosophy, not a distortion. As we'll see in the next section, most of the details Plato includes about the trial and Socrates' political beliefs are in fact affirmed by Xenophon. So no, I don't think Plato is outright lying to us. But he is misleading us by leaving out some very key details. No matter the author, whether it's Plato or Xenophon, the purpose of Socratic apologia was to portray Socrates as the paradigm of moral virtue. Which virtue Socrates exemplified changed depending on the ideals of the author, of course, but no matter who's writing, the main thing that the author wants you to know is that Socrates was just such a great guy. The chief difference between the oracle story in Plato and the version in Xenophon is that in Xenophon, the oracle states that there is no one more free, upright, and prudent than Socrates. Xenophon's mission was to make Socrates out to be a paragon of conventional virtue, and to explore what inner conditions are required for such virtue. And so his Socrates is free, upright, and prudent, rather than wise. Xenophon avoids mentioning wisdom because its corollary was Socratic ignorance, Plato's Socrates was wiser than anyone else because he was the only one who was aware of his ignorance. But ignorance is not one of the traits of Xenophon's Socrates, who spends most of his time advising others what to do. What we have, then, is an exquisite case of intertextuality between the two authors. Plato used the oracle story to establish his mission in writing, and Xenophon, recognizing that this is what Plato had done, did the same for his own mission. So if the character of Socrates differed between Xenophon and Plato, who can we trust to tell us what Socrates' political views were? And how do we know that the trial even happened as they portrayed it? Thankfully, as I mentioned before, on these points they are in agreement. If there were significant differences between the political views Plato ascribes to Socrates and those to be found in Xenophon's works, we would have no way to say which of them, if either of them, was being true to his mentor. But in fact, the views they ascribe to Socrates in this respect complement one another perfectly. Socrates approached political philosophy via the question, who should rule? He took rulership to be a profession. The ruler should not be partisan, but just an expert ruler. And he argued that professional rulership meant improving the lot, and especially the moral behavior of the citizens. Socrates argues that any just man, such as himself, who takes part in democratic politics, will be killed. He accepts that he is commonly viewed as an enemy of democracy. He denies the educational value of the democratic inherited conglomerate and even suggests that this kind of education is a major cause of corruption. He states his preference for following his own conscience rather than the collective will of the masses. He makes himself out to be morally superior to the jury because they expect him to resort to the usual methods of invoking pity, which he says are beneath his dignity. He expresses surprise that so many people voted for him in the first instance, which is to express surprise that the Athenian legal system might actually work in favor of an innocent man. He criticizes the legal system for restricting the time allowed for his defense. He charges the dicasts with acquitting only flatterers and yes-men. So far from directly addressing the charge of impiety, he claims that he would be an atheist if he stopped doing what he did, and to have a superior sense of piety to that of the dicasts. And finally, his suggestion that he should be fed at public expense amounts to a refusal to accept the authority of the dicasts to find him guilty. Socrates undoubtedly did adopt this tactless approach. It is Xenophon's express purpose to explain why this tone of voice was not as ill-considered as it might seem, because according to Xenophon, the elderly philosopher preferred death to a prolonged old age. And the upshot is that, even if we conclude that Socrates did mount a defense against the charges, as recent scholars have argued, contrary to an earlier tendency to see the speeches as sheer provocation, it was one that would have worked only if the majority of the dicasts had already been confirmed Socratics. Plato was aware of this. On one of the several occasions when he refers in later works, more or less obliquely, to the trial, he has Socrates say, "My trial will be equivalent to a doctor being prosecuted by a pastry cook before a jury of children." And on another occasion, he celebrates the unworldliness of philosophers and how useless they are in court. Both Plato and Xenophon wanted to give their readers the impression that a high-minded philosopher was convicted by the stupidity of a mob, but this was also an attempt to distract attention from the real reasons Socrates was killed. We'll get to the real reasons of why Socrates was killed in just a minute, but I want to take a little time and explore the anti-egalitarian views which Socrates held and taught to his students. One of Socrates' core beliefs was that ruling was its own kind of craft, and that just as we should defer to the expertise of doctors in matters of health, we should also defer to the leadership of experts in the political sphere. Now, unfortunately, after questioning all the experts in town, Socrates found that none of them stood up to scrutiny. So, who should really be in charge? If you ask Plato, it's the philosophers, of course. And in the Gorgias, Socrates ever so humbly says, "I think I am one of few, not to say the only one, in Athens who attempts the true art of statesmanship, and the only man of the present time who manages affairs of state." Hence, as the speeches that I make from time to time are not aimed at gratification, but at what is best. It's funny how that turns out, isn't it? Everyone's an idiot, except for me, of course. When we dig under the layers of Socratic irony, we find that Socrates wasn't as ignorant as he claimed to be. He obviously seems to believe that he knows what's right politically and morally. And while he claimed not to be a sophist because he didn't charge fees, and he claimed virtue couldn't be taught, he obviously had students to which he imparted his, again, quite anti-egalitarian political views upon. Now, while politics and ethics seem to be quite separate spheres today, during that period, the most important political question of the day was, what is virtue? This was a big debate, and one we'll explore more fully later. But the point is that, even though it seems all Socrates talks about is virtue, making him seem very lofty as if all he cares about is morality, we shouldn't forget that Socrates' mission was as much a political one as it was an ethical one. Socrates could see that the long-feared world war was about to begin. He knew that it would be vital, whatever the outcome, for Athens to emerge from the other side of the war with men of principle in charge, and so he decided to focus on teaching the young, and especially on training them in morality and politics. Hence, Plato portrays his first question, on returning from Potidaea, as a concern for the attainments or promise of the young men of that city, and it is Charmides who was to become one of his select group of politically promising young men, to whom he is introduced. Pericles had Damon, Protagoras, and Anaxagoras to help him form his policies and present them. The sophists in general often had the aim of turning out competent statesmen. Socrates wanted to play the same role, in his way, for the next generation of Athenian statesmen. It was a momentous decision, and he paid for it with his life. Socrates did not shrink from the corollary to his call for expertise in government. The contention, familiar from the critics of democracy, that democratic government puts power into the hands of the ignorant masses, that the mass wisdom on which democratic procedure was predicated was an oxymoronic fiction. On the contrary, because of their ignorance, the masses are easily misled by speakers who aim to flatter and persuade rather than to educate, as a true statesman would. In keeping with this, Socrates believed that deliberation with oneself or with just a few others was the best means for reaching the truth, not public mass deliberation. Not that mass deliberation is by its very nature doomed to failure, but reaching the truth requires freedom from the pressure of time or partisan interests, both of which are more likely to play a part in public meetings than in a small group. But the masses, in the mass, are a source of corruption and are riddled with false values. One can acquire virtue only under the right conditions, and manual work is a major impediment. Such snobbery about work was typical of upper-class Greeks, but we should not be too quick to judge. Before the days of universal education, the condition of the poor was, in many respects, benighted, and the sentiment lingered long. Even in the 18th century, the Scottish philosopher David Hume opined that poverty and hard labor debase the minds of the common people. Socrates, anyway, thought the cobbler should keep to his last, that butchers, bakers, and oil lamp makers were generally equipped only to recognize the value of a true leader, and otherwise should stick to their areas of expertise, leaving politics to dedicated political experts, on the bizarre principle, later taken up by Plato, that each person properly has one and only one job to do. This is why Plato admits that for Socrates, the Spartan and Cretan constitutions were models of good government, because these societies were highly structured. If Plato went on to develop political views based on a stratification of society into workers and experts, he was hardly breaking away from his mentor. Socrates obviously had little love for democracy, which raises the question, was Socrates killed simply for his political or religious beliefs? I'm not so sure. As you're probably aware, and as we've explored somewhat on this channel so far, Socrates was not the only one who had criticism for traditional societal values. Not by a long shot. As Robin Waterfield points out, the roll call of contemporary critics of Athenian democracy during its flowering in the 5th and 4th centuries is impressive. It includes not just men of action, such as Alcibiades and Critias, but just about all the intellectuals who come to mind. The playwrights, both comic and tragic, though their personal positions are more or less impossible to assess, since it is only their characters who voice opinions. The orators, occasionally and usually just for tenditious purposes. The historian Thucydides, philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, Xenophon, Isocrates, and Aristotle, and pamphleteers such as the anonymous author of the Constitution of the Athenians, who is familiarly known as Old Oligarch. They had a limited number of points to make, and they made them more or less forcefully, but the points they were making were essentially those that were repeated over the centuries, and left Athenian democracy with a poor reputation up until the 19th century. There have always been many who agreed with Alcibiades that Athenian democracy was unequivocal folly. Similarly, Socrates' so-called impiety was also not unusual for Athens during this period, nor was it particularly offensive. Almost all of the most potent arguments against the existence of a divinity or the validity of worship were deployed by Socrates' contemporaries, and this fact exasperates the puzzle of Socrates' trial. Since the Athenians were clearly prepared to tolerate impiety in some contexts, we will be forced to look deeper than the charge of impiety to see why Socrates was taken to court. Plato's Socrates showed how the belief in the gods' essential goodness could clash with ordinary Greek thinking about the gods. Since the god is good, he cannot be responsible for everything, as is commonly said. He and he alone must be held responsible for good things, but responsibility for bad things must be looked for elsewhere and not attributed to the god. In normal Greek thinking about the gods, Apollo, for instance, was not just the god of light and culture, but also the bringer of plagues. Poseidon made earthquakes. Nevertheless, just as it is inconceivable to us now that anyone could get into trouble for stressing the goodness of the gods, so it was just as inconceivable then. Even Homer, the founder of much Greek thinking about the gods, had Zeus complain at one point that humans attribute their troubles to the gods, when in fact they bring them on themselves. If Socrates was guilty of impiety, this belief of his is not the place to look for it. At most, he could be considered mildly eccentric in this respect. If you haven't studied ancient Athens or Greek philosophy, some of this may come as a surprise to you. It was definitely something which surprised me when I first started studying the Greeks. That again, Athens, home of democracy, liberalism, and relative equality before the law, could produce such famous thinkers who have some pretty backwards views at times. Now, we're not here to judge the people of the past by today's standards. I mean, like breaking news. Aristocrats from 2,500 years ago didn't have the most progressive views. It shouldn't be that shocking to us. No, the purpose of this channel is to understand the cultural heritage of the quote-unquote West, whatever that is, the good and the bad. Because criticism is a big part of that great heritage, and a very important part. So there'll be no hero worship or bootlicking on this channel. We let Plato control the narrative last time we talked about the trial. But this time, we're going to tear down the myth, and take a look at what Plato doesn't want us to see. To understand the real reason why Socrates was put on trial, we need to back up a little. We need to talk about the 30 Tyrants. After Athens was defeated by Sparta in the long and brutal Peloponnesian War, an oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants was installed by the Spartans to rule over the city and to keep it in check. Athenian leaders who had opposed peace with Sparta were sentenced to death, along with many other so-called malignants. Normal citizens had their property seized and were exiled from the city. Critias, one of Plato's uncles, happened to be one of these 30 tyrants, and he soon became the leading member of the 30 Tyrants. He was known for presiding over a reign of terror, with some historians calling him the first Robespierre, though I would argue that Critias was even worse. Xenophon compared him with Alcibiades, another controversial student of Socrates, saying that Critias and Alcibiades became disciples of Socrates and did the city much harm. For in the oligarchy, Critias turned into the most thievish and violent and murderous of all, while Alcibiades, in the Democracy, was of all men the most uncontrolled and wanton and violent. If the two of them did the city harm, I shall not offer a defense. By the end of the Reign of Terror, around 1,500 Athenians had been executed, along with about 5,000 who were banished. Plato tells us that Socrates defied unjust orders from the 30, like when they ordered him to help arrest a wealthy resident alien simply so they could kill him and seize his property. But while he didn't obey the order, he also didn't protest it. He didn't try to stop them or warn the victim. He just went home. If Socrates had actually stood against the oligarchy, he would have been killed a lot sooner, or at least exiled. But no, he remained in Athens for the duration of the Reign of Terror, which was not a great look in the eyes of the average Athenian citizen. What was even worse is that, as we just heard from Xenophon, Critias was one of Socrates' students, along with the previously mentioned Alcibiades, a man famous for many things, but above all for the many different scandals he was involved in. Socrates' relationship with Alcibiades has received much attention throughout history, thanks in part to how different these two figures appear at first glance. There is a fascination of the pairing of these two opposites, a fascination which has long attracted poets, sculptors, and painters. Socrates frittered away a modest fortune, while Alcibiades flaunted his obscene wealth. Socrates contained his appetites, while Alcibiades indulged them. Alcibiades was a fervent imperialist, wedded to the notion that might is right, while Socrates insisted that it was never right to harm anyone under any circumstances. Socrates focused on inner change as the foundation for moral action in the outer world, while Alcibiades ignored his soul and preferred to conquer the world as he found it. And yet they were a couple of sorts, and Alcibiades became the vehicle for Socrates' political aspirations. But they were not only opposites. Both men pushed the envelope in their respective ways, and so came to be accused of impiety or un-Athenian activities. Both men were admired and feared in almost equal measure. Neither expected to adjust to the city, but expected the city to adjust to them. Both were, in a sense, scapegoats. Both in their interlocking, divergent ways, fused two of the greatest and most enduring trends of 5th century Athenian culture: politics and philosophy. Now, Alcibiades really deserves his own video. Maybe if I get enough comments about it, I'll make one. But nothing sums up the character of Alcibiades better than what the speechwriter Andocides said of him. That instead of holding that he ought himself to conform with the laws of the state, he expects you to conform with his own way of life. And don't forget, Critias was Plato's uncle, and he wasn't the only of Plato's relatives associated with the tyrants. He had another uncle, Charmides, who was one of the 10 men appointed by the 30 to govern the Piraeus, and as mentioned earlier, another one of Socrates' students. So between Alcibiades, Critias, Charmides, and Plato, I think you can see how maybe Socrates' philosophy wasn't the thing that got him in trouble, as much as his association with controversial, anti-democratic figures did. I mean, those were just the famous troublemakers. Who knows about the rest? It certainly makes the charge of corrupting the youth make much more sense. The context of history makes this even clearer. As I mentioned earlier, Athens had just gone through 30 years of war, enduring crisis after crisis, which threatened the city and its institutions. There was a real fear that the independence of the Athenian assembly would be forever crushed by tyrannical forces, a fear which went back to the earliest memories of Athenian democracy, and which had threatened to come true multiple times during this period. The installation of the 30 Tyrants wasn't the only attempt at ending democracy in Athens over the course of the war. There was also the coup of 411 BCE, organized by none other than Alcibiades. So it's important for us to remember that the citizens of Athens had no way of knowing that, at this point in history, after the fall of the 30, democracy in Athens was essentially secure, at least from internal threats. It wouldn't be until the rise of Macedonia that Athenian democracy would finally come to an end. A fact that we can only know with the benefit of hindsight, after going through so much trauma The paranoia in Athens at that time must have been immense, and it is almost certain that this paranoia was a contributing factor in Socrates' trial and execution. The point is that two prominent Democrats, one of whom was a hero of the revolution against the 30, and still an eminent democratic politician, prosecuted Socrates. Socrates was undoubtedly being tried for his association with Critias, and this is precisely what we find that Athenians themselves believed. Some 50 years later, in 345 BCE, Aeschines cited the case of Socrates the sophist, saying that he had been executed for teaching Critias. After 403, Athenians wanted to stabilize a democracy to prevent further oligarchic coups. This mood was so prevalent that, barring strong opposing reasons, the trial of a man such as Socrates would inevitably be seen as politically motivated. With hindsight, we identify 404 to 403 as a great watershed in Athenian history, but hindsight must not blind us to the fact that Athenians at that time did not know that they had defeated the forces of tyranny and narrow oligarchy once and for all, or at least until the democracy was overwhelmed by an external power. They thought they were still fighting these internal enemies, shoring up the democracy. It's clear that the trial of Socrates was just a symptom of a wider social crisis in Athens. A crisis which was triggered in no small part by the long and devastating Peloponnesian War, resulting in a radical reevaluation of social norms and cultural values. Take, for example, the rise of the sophists, who challenged almost all conventional wisdom, or Socrates himself, who, as we heard from the previous quote, was lumped in with the sophists thanks to his own radical questioning and style of teaching. And if we compare this period to times of great social change in modern history, we'll see that there are many parallels. Social crisis manifests in different ways in different societies, but war-torn Athens, the Athens of the last third of the 5th century BCE, was affected by a striking list of stress factors. Old certainties were being undermined by prolonged warfare, morally subversive ideas, population displacement, relative poverty following a period of relative prosperity, the polarization of rich and poor, turbulence with occasional outbursts of violence, even civil war, especially disturbing since Athens had been so free of civil strife compared with many Greek states, the reorganization of the law code, changes of fashion, and changes in the economic structure. If these do not add up to a social crisis, it is hard to see what might. Athenian society was not in meltdown, but it was far from tranquil. Perhaps a useful parallel would be the tumult experienced by much of the First World in the 1960s. The hippie revolution was a genuine social crisis, and a number of important social ideas took root, which have caused permanent changes in areas such as business practices, healthcare, religion, treatment of the environment, attitudes towards women, and tolerance of alternative lifestyle choices, to name only the most important. But North American or European society after the changes was still recognizably the same as it was before. Historians in the future will look back and find plenty of continuities, and some of them will doubt the relevance of the term crisis, as do some historians of classical Athens. But anyone who lived through those times had no doubt that it was precisely applicable. Apart from anything else, dozens of young people around the world were legally killed by the authorities for trying to bring about these changes. So it should come as no surprise that the Athenian crisis, one aspect of which was also intergenerational conflict, could also prove deadly, as it did for Socrates, charged with corrupting the young. Social crises do not occur unless there is a critical level of dissatisfaction with the way things are. Although there were rumblings as early as the 430s, when political divisions in Athens became sharper and gave aristocrats a focus for their discontent, 415 was the watershed year, when all the latent tensions were brought out into the open and helped to queer the Sicilian expedition, which more or less ended Athenian hopes for a successful outcome to the war. The effect of the stresses was only accelerated by the realization that, unless the gods or Alcibiades could produce a miracle, defeat was assured. Apart from any of the other critical factors, Imagine yourself an Athenian living day after day, year after year, with the knowledge that before long you would become subject to your deadliest enemy. As I said in the beginning, classical Athens was a time when fundamental values were in conflict. The elite chafed at the limits which the democratic system placed on their ambitions. And after the numerous catastrophes which unfolded under the leadership of the assembly, many aristocrats wished to turn back the clock. As Robin Waterfield explains, all societies have to find a balance between cooperative and competitive values. They cannot afford to suppress the energy of individuality completely, but neither can they afford to let it destabilize the status quo. But as the life of Alcibiades illustrates, in Athens in the last quarter of the 5th century, elite resentment of democracy had reached the point where some aristocrats insisted on the right to develop their own talents and follow their own predilections, even at the risk of offending their fellow citizens or transgressing the inherited moral code. Painters and sculptors began to portray their subjects with greater individuality. Playwrights showed some of the difficulties with rampant individualism. In the middle of the 420s, after 75 years of restraint, tombs and their offerings abruptly began once again to be lavish, indicating a swing away from group orientation to individuality and aristocratic competitiveness. Aristocrats resented the fact that the state had usurped many of their traditional paths to glory. There were a few arenas where they could gain prestige: politics, the courts, athletics, but even here, the shine was taken off their glory by the fact that they were rewarded by democratic consensus. It seemed to them as though being a good citizen and being a true man were incompatible. The question which served as a focus for inquiry into these matters was simply, what is virtue? Meaning, what does it take to be an outstanding human being? The question was particularly poignant for Athenian aristocrats. It had previously been assumed, especially by them, that it was an easy question to answer. They were the best. And this was proved by the fact that the gods had granted them wealth and all the other blessings. Virtue was an innate and hereditary aristocratic gift, which brought with it certain necessary consequences, such as the ability to master other people, to rule. But what became of the old aristocratic virtues when egalitarianism was rampant, competition was suspected as often as it was admired, and the people not only had the power to make or break a man who partook in public life, but had effectively set themselves up as judges of what was and was not virtuous behavior? How could one achieve the success of a Cimon, Themistocles, or Pericles? The new politicians who achieved prominence from the 420s in the wake of Pericles' death were often not even the old aristocratic class, and yet they took it upon themselves to rule. Was rulership not an innate quality then? Was it something teachable, as Protagoras and others claimed? Something anyone of any class or background could acquire? The social crisis made these burning issues. The fabric of Athenian society was beginning to come apart at its most vulnerable seam, that of the tension between the elite and the ordinary citizens. Athenian democracy had institutionalized a number of ways to curb the competitiveness of the elite and exploit it for democratically acceptable purposes, while formerly aristocrats had largely been content to scale back their competitiveness for the good of the community and for the sake of concord. But now the elite were beginning to break free of these bonds and to return to their Homeric roots. That is why, in the 430s, Athenian politics became polarized between democrats and oligarchs. For the first time, the elite were dissatisfied with democratic values and needed slogans with which to identify their own interests. The conflict between competitive and cooperative values became highly charged and emotive. And so, Alcibiades, in his desire to be a Homeric hero, was tarred with the brush of tyranny, since he clearly had little respect for the boundaries of collectivism or democracy. The moral and social crisis in Athens was triggered by, among other things, the questioning of inherited values. Socrates, the great questioner, was of course instrumental in this. His image of himself as a horsefly, sent by the god to stir the somnolent city into wakefulness, is very precise. A horsefly swoops in, settles somewhere, bites, and flies off again. Everywhere he settled, every individual he interrogated, is taken to represent the inherited conglomerate, the horse, not to be an individual whose irritation begins and ends with the individual himself. But Socrates was, in a sense, a conservative, in that he reacted against the fact that customs had been questioned without being replaced by anything constructive. He tried to teach his followers to question in a productive manner, in a way that would reveal underlying assumptions and help others to make moral progress. He felt he had something to offer Athens, even if at his trial, the Athenians terminally rejected his vision of what makes a good citizen and what makes a good state. If you learned anything today, I hope you see that Socrates was a deeply complex person with some kind of noticeable flaws, like pretty much everyone else. The real impiety of Socrates in the eyes of the Athenian citizens was not so much that he challenged the classical gods, but that he challenged the institutions of Athens itself. He corrupted the youth by undermining their faith in democracy, though of course some of his criticisms were obviously valid. Athenian democracy was a flawed system after all, prone to demagogues, sophists, and sycophants, as we'll explore in future videos. But as Winston Churchill famously said, no one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. I believe that the greatness of societies, both past and present, is directly correlated with the amount of value that they place on democratic freedoms and rights. I believe that what makes the West great is that, overall, we value democracy, liberty, and the human rights which make it all possible. Sure, the history of democracy is full of failure and pretty horrible mistakes. But as Demosthenes observed, only in Athens could you criticize democracy and praise the Spartan constitution, while in Sparta, you could only praise Sparta. It's hopefully obvious that I have a deep love and respect for the West and its liberal democratic values. I mean, I wouldn't have spent so much time reading all these damn books if that wasn't the case. But just because Plato is one of the greatest Western philosophers, doesn't mean he'll be safe from a critical investigation. When we explore the Republic, we'll see how, as Karl Popper famously argued in his work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, the rise of totalitarian ideologies in the 20th century can be traced back to the historicism, which underlies both the philosophy of Plato and modern ideologies like Marxism. In fact, Plato's ideal republic is much more of a totalitarian communist utopia than an actual republic as we define the word today. And as we'll see in an upcoming video, Plato collaborated with, not against, the tyrants of nearby Syracuse. So just as there is a long and rich democratic tradition in the West, going back to classical Athens, as we saw today, the anti-democratic tradition goes back just as far. Like many so-called conservatives today, in many ways Plato was simply a reactionary, deeply afraid of, and therefore against, the profound societal changes which he lived through. What's become painfully clear to me is that if you don't understand your history, you have no idea what's worth conserving. So if we actually care about preserving the traditions and institutions which make democratic life possible, then we need to understand the history of democracy. Because the challenges which Athenian democracy faced have not gone away. Today we are also faced with increased polarization, political violence, and extreme challenges to democratic norms, not just here in the United States, but around the world. It's obvious that democracy really is only as strong as the education that surrounds it, which is why I'm so passionate about education. So we're going to take a critical look at the history of democratic Athens, and we're going to explore some uncomfortable parallels between the past and the present. So this is only the beginning of our exploration of Athenian democracy and politics. I'm not going to talk about politics all the time, that's not what this channel's about. But we can't understand philosophy without understanding political philosophy. We are political animals, as Aristotle recognized. So if you'd like to learn more about the political circumstances surrounding Socrates' trial and execution, I highly recommend Robin Waterfield's book. As the blurb on the back says, it is both authoritative and accessible, making it a very enjoyable read. Anyways, if you'd like to support the channel, make sure to leave a like and comment down below. It really does help. And consider donating to my Ko-fi page. Because let me tell you, software and book expenses add up quicker than you'd think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.